She was a virgin, discreet and invisible in the world that crushed her. He, a reclusive millionaire, made the boldest proposal of his life. "Travel with me and you will never have to work again," he said with eyes that hid abysses. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you are listening from. Clara Whitmore had perfected the art of invisibility long before she arrived at Ravenshollow Manor. At 24, she moved through the grand halls like morning mist, her presence so carefully diminished that even the shadows seemed more substantial than she. The grey uniform she wore daily had become her armour, a deliberate shroud that kept the world at bay, and her secrets buried deep beneath layers of practiced silence. The manor itself was a testament to English Gothic revival, its stone walls rising from the Yorkshire moors like a monument to solitude. Built in the mid-19th century, Ravenshollow stood isolated among rolling hills and ancient oak trees, its windows staring out across the windswept landscape with the vacant gaze of someone who had seen too much. The house was filled with echoes, not just of footsteps on marble floors, but of lives lived and lost, of whispered conversations in empty rooms, of secrets that clung to the walls like morning dew. Clara had been cleaning these same corridors for 3 months now, her days structured around the meticulous care of objects that held more value than she had ever seen in her entire life. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings like frozen tears, their countless facets catching and fragmenting what little light managed to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. Persian rugs sprawled across polished floors, their intricate patterns telling stories in languages she couldn't read. Oil paintings in gilded frames watched her work with eyes that seemed to follow her movements, their subjects' expressions ranging from benevolent to decidedly unsettling. She had learned early to keep her gaze lowered, to polish and dust and sweep without truly seeing, without allowing herself to wonder about the lives that had unfolded within these walls. Questions were dangerous things for someone in her position, and Clara had long ago trained herself not to ask them. Better to remain unnoticed, unremarkable, safe in the margins of other people's lives. Her own history was a patchwork of temporary places and temporary people, stitched together with the coarse thread of institutional care. The children's homes had been clean enough, adequately staffed, fundamentally lacking in anything resembling warmth or genuine affection. Clara had learned to navigate their rigid structures and unspoken rules, had discovered early that the children who caused trouble were the ones who disappeared first, sometimes to better placements, more often to worse ones. The worst of it hadn't been the neglect, though the succession of indifferent caretakers had certainly left their mark. No, the worst had been Mr. Henderson at the older children's facility, with his too soft voice and wandering hands, his ability to make his interest in certain girls seem like special attention, like favor. Clara had been 13 when she learned to pick locks, not out of curiosity or mischief, but out of necessity. She had taught herself to sleep lightly, to wake at the softest footstep in the corridor, to disappear into the shadows between the dormitory beds when that particular set of footsteps approached. By 16, she had perfected her invisibility. By 18, she had aged out of the system entirely, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and an acute understanding that the world was not a safe place for girls like her. Girls with no family, no connections, no voice that anyone particularly wanted to hear. The transition to domestic service had been natural enough. She was clean, quiet, and competent. She followed instructions without question and never complained about the long hours or meager wages. Most importantly, she knew how to be present without being noticed, how to anticipate needs without intruding, how to make herself useful without making herself memorable. Ravenshollow Manor had been different from her previous positions from the very beginning, though Clara couldn't quite articulate why. The advertisement in the Yorkshire Post had been strangely specific. Young woman sought for housekeeping position at private estate, must be unmarried, unattached, and available for extended periods of residence. Experience preferred but not required. Discretion essential. The interview had been conducted not by the housekeeper, as she had expected, but by a thin, nervous man named Stevens, who seemed more interested in studying her face than her references. He had asked odd questions, whether she had family who might worry about her, whether she suffered from nightmares, whether she had ever experienced what he delicately termed supernatural encounters. Clara had answered honestly that she had no one who would miss her, that she was a deep sleeper, and that she was far too practical to believe in ghosts. Stevens had hired her on the spot. The other staff at Ravens Hollow were few in number and strangely reticent. Mrs. Hartwell, the cook, was a stout Yorkshire woman who spoke mainly in grunts and kept her kitchen locked after hours. James, the groundskeeper, was ancient and nearly deaf, spending his days tending to gardens that seemed perpetually on the verge of running wild. There were two other housemaids, Mary and Sophie, but they worked different schedules than Clara and seemed to make a point of avoiding her when their paths did cross. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of any sign of the master of the house. Gael Romanelli was a name whispered in the village pub, spoken of in the same tones reserved for ghost stories and local legends. Some claimed he was foreign royalty in exile. Others insisted he was a reclusive millionaire who had made his fortune in questionable circumstances. The more dramatic village gossips suggested he was some sort of dark magician, practicing forbidden arts in the depths of his ancestral home. Clara had been working at Ravens Hollow for 3 months without catching so much as a glimpse of her mysterious employer. She cleaned his study daily, noting the way papers appeared and disappeared from his desk, the way books moved from shelf to shelf as if by invisible hands. She polished silver that bore the Romanelli crest, dusted paintings of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her movements, maintained rooms that felt occupied even when empty. The master's bedroom was strictly off-limits, but Clara was responsible for the sitting room adjacent to it, a masculine space filled with leather-bound books and heavy furniture. Sometimes she caught traces of his presence, the faint scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air, the impression of a body recently risen from the leather chair by the fireplace, the sense that she had just missed him by moments. It was on a grey October afternoon, when fog rolled across the moors like smoke from some vast unseen fire, that Clara received the summons that would change everything. Stevens appeared in the corridor where she was cleaning silver candlesticks, his usually pale face even whiter than usual. "Mr. Romanelli requests your presence in the main drawing room," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Immediately." Clara's hands stilled on the candlestick she was polishing. In 3 months of employment, she had never been summoned anywhere. She had perfected the art of being useful without being noticed, and sudden attention felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite name. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. Stevens shook his head, but his expression remained troubled. "Just be careful, miss, and whatever he asks of you, consider your answer very carefully indeed." The main drawing room was a cavernous space that Clara had cleaned countless times, but never truly entered. The furniture was arranged around a massive fireplace, its mantel decorated with artifacts that seemed to come from every corner of the world. Persian carpets covered the floors in layers, creating an almost maze-like effect. Heavy velvet drapes blocked most of the natural light, leaving the room dependent on the warm glow of strategically placed lamps. He was standing with his back to her when she entered, one hand resting on the mantelpiece, the other holding a crystal tumbler filled with what looked like whiskey. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a perfectly tailored black suit that emphasized the elegant lines of his frame. His dark hair was slightly longer than fashion dictated, touching the collar of his white shirt in a way that suggested he cared little for conventional appearances. "Close the door behind you," he said without turning around. His voice was rich and deep, touched with an accent that Clara couldn't quite place. Not entirely English, but not foreign either. Something in between, as if he had lived many places and belonged fully to none of them. Clara did as instructed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had imagined this moment countless times, wondering what her mysterious employer might look like, what sort of man commanded such wealth and inspired such whispered speculation. She had pictured someone older, perhaps, someone whose face might explain the air of mystery that surrounded him. She was not prepared for him to be beautiful. When he turned to face her, Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. Gael Romanelli was perhaps 35, with the kind of classical features that belonged in marble rather than flesh. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that were almost feminine in their perfect symmetry. But it was his eyes that held her transfixed, deep green like the depths of ancient forests, surrounded by thick, dark lashes that should have softened his features, but somehow made them more compelling instead. "Clara Whitmore," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her shiver, as if he had been practicing it, rolling it around his tongue until it fit perfectly. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely audible. He moved closer, and Clara caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something darker and more primal, cedar and smoke, and something that reminded her of storms rolling across open water. "You've been here 3 months," he continued, circling her slowly like a predator examining prey. Clara forced herself to remain still, to keep her eyes lowered, to maintain the careful invisibility that had protected her for so long. "Yes, sir. And in that time, you've cleaned every room in this house save one. You've polished silver that's worth more than most people see in a lifetime. You've handled artifacts that museums would kill to possess." He paused directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "And yet you've never once asked a single question about any of it. Remarkable restraint." Clara wasn't sure if he was praising her or mocking her, so she said nothing. "Look at me, Clara." It wasn't a request. Clara raised her eyes reluctantly, meeting that unsettling green gaze for the first time. Up close, she could see that his beauty wasn't entirely human. There was something otherworldly about the sharp angles of his face, something predatory about the way he watched her breathe. "Better," he murmured. "I have a proposition for you." He moved away from her then, settling into one of the leather chairs and gesturing for her to sit across from him. Clara perched on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "I require a companion for an extended journey," he began, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "Someone discreet, adaptable, and unencumbered by family obligations or romantic attachments. The position would involve considerable travel, often to remote locations, sometimes for weeks at a time." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "I don't understand, sir. I'm just a housemaid. Are you?" His head tilted slightly, and that predatory smile played at the corners of his mouth again. "Tell me, Clara, what do you know about your family history?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "I don't have any family, sir. I was raised in care." "Yes, I'm aware. But everyone comes from somewhere, don't they? Everyone has ancestors, bloodlines, connections that reach back through time like roots through soil." He leaned forward, his green eyes never leaving hers. "What if I told you that your history isn't as empty as you believe? What if I told you that you were chosen for this position, not despite your lack of connections, but because of them?" Clara's mouth had gone dry. "I don't understand." "You will." He stood and moved to a writing desk in the corner, returning with an envelope of heavy cream paper. "This journey I'm proposing, it's not optional, Clara. It began long before you were born, and it will continue long after we're both gone. The only choice you have is whether to participate willingly or unwillingly." He held out the envelope, and Clara stared at it as if it were a snake. "What's in there?" "Proof," he said simply. "Proof that your life, your placement in this house, your very existence, has been orchestrated by forces you can't begin to comprehend. But also proof that you have a choice. You can open this envelope, accept what it contains, and embark on a journey that will change everything you thought you knew about yourself. Or you can leave this room, pack your belongings, and walk away from Raven's Hollow Manor forever." Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. The paper was thick and expensive, sealed with black wax that bore the same crest she had polished on countless pieces of silver throughout the house. Her name was written across the front in elegant script that looked more like calligraphy than ordinary handwriting. "If I open this," she whispered, "there's no going back." Gael's smile was sharp as winter wind. "There was never any going back, Clara. Not for you and not for me. The only question is whether we move forward together, or whether you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Clara broke the seal. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, old and sepia-toned, showing a young woman in Victorian dress standing beside an ornate gravestone. The woman's face was Clara's face, identical in every detail save for the clothing and the hairstyle. The gravestone bore an inscription that made Clara's blood run cold. "Clara Victoria Romanelli, beloved wife, 1849-1871, she waits for her return." "Impossible," Clara breathed. "Is it?" Gael moved to stand behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. Clara should have pulled away, should have been frightened by the intimate contact, but instead she found herself leaning into his touch. Look at the date on the back of the photograph. Clara flipped the image over with numb fingers. October 15th, 1871, the day Clara Romanelli died. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. Today is October 15th. Happy birthday, my dear, Gail said softly. Now, shall we discuss the terms of your employment? The room seemed to spin around Clara as she tried to process what she was seeing, what he was suggesting. This is madness. You're talking about reincarnation, about... She shook her head violently. It's impossible. Is it more impossible than a girl with no family, no connections, no past, finding herself in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to hear exactly the right offer? Gail moved around to face her again, kneeling beside her chair so that their faces were level. Clara, you've spent your entire life feeling like you didn't belong anywhere, haven't you? Like you were waiting for something you couldn't name, searching for something you couldn't define. Against her will, Clara found herself nodding. It was true. She had always felt displaced, as if she were living someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin. I can give you answers, he continued, his voice soft and hypnotic. I can show you places you've only dreamed of, help you understand why you've always felt different, special, set apart from everyone around you. But the journey won't be easy and it won't be safe. Are you brave enough to take it? Clara stared down at the photograph in her trembling hands. The woman in the image looked back at her with eyes that held secrets, with lips curved in a smile that suggested she knew something Clara desperately needed to learn. If I say yes, she whispered, what happens to me? Gail's hand covered hers, warm and strong and strangely comforting. You discover who you really are. You claim the life that should have been yours. You stop hiding in the shadows and step into the light. Clara looked up at him, this beautiful, dangerous man who claimed to know her history better than she knew it herself. Every instinct she had developed over years of careful survival screamed at her to run, to pack her few belongings and disappear into the anonymity of another position, another town, another carefully constructed life of invisibility. But as she met his green gaze, she felt something stirring deep inside her chest, not fear but hunger. A terrible, wonderful hunger for truth, for answers, for the life she had never been brave enough to claim. When do we leave? She asked. Gail's smile was triumphant and predatory, and somehow tender all at once. Tomorrow morning. Pack light. We'll be traveling extensively, and worldly possessions will only weigh us down. He stood, offering her his hand. Welcome to your real life, Clara Romanelli. Clara slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with images that felt more like memories than fantasies. She saw herself in flowing white gowns, walking through corridors that were familiar, yet different from Ravenshallow's halls. She saw Gail, but not as he was now, younger, dressed in Victorian clothing, his hair longer. His eyes filled with a desperate longing that made her chest ache with sympathy. She didn't understand. Most disturbing of all, she saw herself dying. The dream Clara lay in a four-poster bed, her face pale as winter snow, her breathing shallow and labored. Gail knelt beside the bed, his hands clutching hers with desperate intensity, whispering words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. Promises, pleas, vows that transcended death itself. She felt the life leaving her body like water flowing out of a broken vessel, felt his anguish as acutely as her own fading consciousness. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a burning sensation on her left wrist that made her cry out in shock. Rolling up her sleeve, she found a mark there that definitely hadn't existed the day before, a small, intricate symbol that looked like a key intertwined with a rose, the skin around it red and tender, as if it had been branded while she slept. Clara stared at the mark in the grey, pre-dawn light filtering through her small window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her fingers against it experimentally and gasped at the sharp pain that shot up her arm. Whatever had happened to her during the night, it had been real, physical, permanent. A soft knock at her door interrupted her panicked examination of the mark. Miss Clara. Stephen's voice was even more nervous than usual. Mr. Romanelli requests that you join him for breakfast before your departure. Clara dressed quickly in her best traveling dress, a simple grey wool. That had been practical enough for her previous positions, but suddenly felt shabby and inadequate for whatever lay ahead. She pinned her long brown hair into a neat chignon, hiding the small scar on the back of her neck that she had carried since childhood, and never thought about until yesterday, when Gail had somehow known of its existence. The breakfast room at Ravenshollow was a smaller, more intimate space than the grand dining hall, with tall windows that looked out over the moors. Morning mist clung to the landscape like ghostly fingers, and Clara could see no signs of human habitation beyond the manor's grounds. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt ominous, as if the house existed in its own pocket of reality, disconnected from the ordinary world. Gail was already seated at the polished mahogany table, reading what appeared to be a very old letter. He wore traveling clothes this morning, dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, and a black coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Without the formal barrier of his suit, he seemed more approachable somehow, though no less dangerous. "Good morning, Clara," he said without looking up from his correspondence. "I trust you slept well." Clara pulled back her sleeve and held out her marked wrist. "What did you do to me?" This time, he did look up, his green eyes moving from her face to the symbol on her skin. His expression showed no surprise, but something that might have been satisfaction flickered in his gaze. "I did nothing," he said calmly. "The mark appears when the awakening begins. It's been dormant in your bloodline for generations, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to manifest." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "How does it feel?" "It burns," Clara admitted, sitting down across from him. The table was set with delicate china and crystal, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air. Despite everything, her stomach growled with hunger. "It will fade as you grow accustomed to it, the mark is. Think of it as a compass. It will help you navigate what's to come." Gail poured coffee into her cup, his movements precise and graceful. "Eat something. We have a long journey ahead of us." Clara buttered a piece of warm bread with shaking hands. "Where exactly are we going?" "First to London, then north to the Lake District. There are places I need to show you, records you need to see, people who knew the original Clara." He studied her face carefully. "Are you having second thoughts?" Clara touched the mark on her wrist again, feeling the strange warmth that pulsed beneath her skin in rhythm with her heartbeat. "I don't know what I'm having. Yesterday I was a housemaid with no past and no future. Today you're telling me I'm the reincarnation of your dead wife and expecting me to. What exactly? Pick up where she left off." "I'm expecting you to discover who you truly are," Gail said quietly. "The rest will follow naturally. And if I don't like what I discover," his smile was sharp and sad in equal measure, "then you'll be the first Clara to have that problem." After breakfast, Stevens loaded their luggage into a gleaming black Bentley that looked distinctly out of place against the Gothic backdrop of Ravenshollow Manor. Clara had packed her few belongings into a single battered suitcase, feeling rather foolish next to Gail's expensive leather traveling cases. "Will we be coming back?" she asked as they pulled away from the manor, watching its imposing silhouette disappear into the morning mist. "Eventually," Gail replied, but his tone suggested it wouldn't be any time soon. The drive to London took them through some of the most beautiful countryside Clara had ever seen. Rolling hills gave way to neat villages, with thatched cottages and ancient stone churches, their graveyards filled with weathered headstones that seemed to lean toward each other like old friends, sharing secrets. She found herself pressing her face to the window like a child, drinking in sights she had never had the opportunity to see during her carefully circumscribed life. Gail drove with casual competence, one hand on the steering wheel, his attention seeming to divide between the road ahead and Clara's reaction to the landscape. Every so often she caught him watching her in the reflection of the passenger window, his expression unreadable. "Tell me about the original Clara," she said, as they passed through a particularly picturesque village. "What was she like?" Gail was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before, touched with a longing that made her chest tight with sympathy. She was luminous. Not in the way beautiful women are often described, but literally. She seemed to carry light with her wherever she went, as if she had captured a piece of the sun and held it inside her heart. He glanced at Clara briefly before returning his attention to the road. She was also stubborn, curious to a fault, and absolutely fearless in the face of things that should have terrified her. How did you meet? Her father was the village rector in a small town near Ravenshollow. She used to visit the manor to tutor the children of our servants. My father believed in education for all classes, which was progressive thinking at the time. Gail's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She was 19 when we married, barely 21 when she died. What killed her? The silence stretched between them again, heavy with unspoken pain. Childbirth, he said finally. The baby didn't survive either. A son. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I lost them both in the space of an hour. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though she couldn't say whether they were for Gail's ancient grief or for the woman whose face she wore, whose life she had somehow inherited. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, Gail said firmly. Be ready. Because, if you truly are who I believe you are, then we have a chance to rewrite that ending. London overwhelmed Clara's senses the moment they entered its outskirts. After years of rural quiet, the noise and movement of the city felt like an assault. Cars honked, construction machinery roared, crowds of people moved along the pavements like schools of fish navigating invisible currents. The very air seemed to vibrate with energy and ambition, and barely contained chaos. Gail navigated the busy streets with practiced ease, eventually pulling up in front of an elegant Georgian townhouse in what Clara recognized as an extremely expensive neighborhood. The building was pristine white stone, with black iron railings and window boxes, filled with winter flowers that must have cost more than Clara's monthly wages. We'll be staying here tonight, Gail explained, as a uniformed doorman appeared to take their luggage. Tomorrow we visit the British Library. There are documents there that you need to see. The interior of the townhouse was as impressive as its exterior suggested. High ceilings, original moldings, artwork that Clara suspected might be museum quality. Everything spoke of wealth so old and established that it had transcended the need to show off, becoming instead a quiet statement of absolute confidence in its own worth. The guest room is on the second floor, Gail said, handing her a heavy brass key. Dinner will be served at 7. Dress appropriately. We'll be entertaining a visitor. Clara's room was larger than any space she had ever occupied as her own. The bed was a four-poster draped in midnight blue silk, and tall windows looked out over a private garden that seemed impossible in the heart of the city. Her single suitcase looked rather pathetic, sitting on the antique luggage bench, but when she opened the wardrobe to hang her few dresses, she found it already filled with clothes in exactly her size. The gowns were beautiful, silk and velvet, in jewel tones cut in styles that were fashionable but somehow timeless. Clara pulled out a dress of deep emerald green and held it against herself, watching her reflection in the full-length mirror. The color brought out golden flecks in her brown eyes and made her pale skin seem to glow. She had never owned anything so fine, never even dreamed of wearing such clothes. They belonged to a different world, a different class of person entirely. Yet when she slipped the dress on, it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her body. A soft knock interrupted her admiration of her transformed reflection. "Come in," she called, expecting to see a maid with fresh towels or some other domestic concern. Instead, Gail entered, stopping short when he saw her. The expression that crossed his face was complex. Desire, pain, recognition, and something that might have been fear all mixing together in his green eyes. "You look," he cleared his throat and started again. "That was her favorite color. She wore a dress almost identical to that one the night I proposed." Clara smoothed the silk skirt with nervous hands. "Should I change? I don't want to upset you." "No." His voice was rough with emotion. "You should never change, Clara. Not for me, not for anyone." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the cedar and smoke scent of his cologne. "Are you ready to meet our dinner guest?" "Who is it?" "Professor Margaret Whitehall. She's an expert in genealogy and other matters." She knew the original Clara personally. Gail's hand came up to touch Clara's cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with gentle reverence. She's also the person who helped me track you down after all these years of searching. The dining room was elegant and intimate, lit by candles and warmed by a fire crackling in an ornate fireplace. Professor Whitehall was already seated when they entered, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to look both academic and aristocratic. "My dear girl," she said when she saw Clara, her voice touched with a refined accent that spoke of excellent breeding and Oxford education. "The resemblance is quite remarkable, even more so than the photographs suggested." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks as the older woman studied her with scientific intensity. "Professor Whitehall, I presume?" "Indeed. And you must be Clara." The professor's smile was warm but tinged with sadness. "I knew your predecessor quite well. We were friends, you might say, though the social conventions of the time made that somewhat complicated. Dinner was an elaborate affair of multiple courses served on china that Clara was afraid to touch. The professor regaled them with stories of Victorian society, of the original Clara's intelligence and independence, of her marriage to Gale, and the scandal it had caused among the local gentry. She was considered quite revolutionary for her time, Professor Whitehall explained over the fish course. She insisted on learning Latin and Greek, refused to confine her reading to novels deemed appropriate for young ladies, and had the audacity to express political opinions in mixed company. "Your ancestor caused quite a stir in polite society." "She sounds formidable," Clara said, taking a careful sip of wine that probably cost more than she had earned in a month at Ravenshollow. "Oh, she was. But she was also kind, compassionate, and absolutely devoted to those she loved." The professor's eyes moved meaningfully between Clara and Gale. The love story of Clara and Gale Romanelli became something of a local legend, epic in its passion, tragic in its brevity. After dinner, Professor Whitehall produced a leather portfolio filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be personal letters. Clara found herself staring at page after page of evidence that someone with her exact face had lived and loved and died more than a century ago. "The resemblance extends beyond the physical," the professor noted, watching Clara examine a letter written in handwriting that looked disturbingly similar to her own. "Your speech patterns, your mannerisms, even the way you hold your head when you're thinking. It's all identical to what I remember of the original Clara." "But how is that possible?" Clara asked, though part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Professor Whitehall and Gale exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. "There are forces in this world, my dear," the older woman said carefully, "that modern science has yet to understand or acknowledge. Love, particularly love as intense as what existed between the original Clara and Gale, can transcend the normal boundaries of mortality. You're talking about reincarnation again. I'm talking about souls that refuse to be separated by something as mundane as death." Professor Whitehall corrected gently. "The Romanelli family has been touched by such forces for generations. It's both a gift and a curse." "What do you mean?" Gale leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. "My family line carries what you might call a supernatural burden. We love once completely and eternally, and when that love is taken from us, we persist until it can be restored." Clara felt cold understanding begin to dawn. "You're saying you're the same Gale who was married to the original Clara? That you've been alive for over a century?" "Time moves differently for my kind," he said quietly. "I age but slowly. I can die, but only under very specific circumstances. And I am compelled to search, lifetime after lifetime, for the soul that completes mine. And you think I'm that soul? I know you are." His green eyes burned with absolute certainty. "The mark on your wrist, your face, your very presence here. It all proves what I've hoped for more than 100 years. Clara stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor. "This is insane. You're asking me to believe in fairy tales and ghost stories. You're asking me to think I'm the reincarnation of a woman who died before my great-grandmother was born. I'm asking you to trust what you feel," Gale said, standing as well. "When I touch you, when you look at me, don't you feel recognition? Don't you feel like you've known me forever?" Against her will, Clara found herself nodding. There was something about Gale that felt like coming home, like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she never had before, understood in a way that went beyond words or explanation. "The heart knows what the mind refuses to accept," Professor Whitehall said gently. "And your heart has been searching for him for as long as you can remember, hasn't it?" Clara thought about the loneliness that had defined her life, the sense of waiting for something she couldn't name, the way no relationship had ever felt right, as if she were saving herself for someone who didn't exist, or someone who hadn't found her yet. "Even if all of this is true," she said slowly, "what happens now? Do we just pick up where the original Clara and Gail left off? Do we live happily ever after?" Giles' expression darkened. "It's not that simple. There are others who don't want us to be reunited. Forces that benefit from keeping us apart, from maintaining the cycle of loss and searching that has defined my existence for over a century." "What kind of forces?" "The kind that killed the original Clara," Professor Whitehall said grimly. "And will kill you too if we're not extremely careful." Clara felt the mark on her wrist begin to burn again, a sensation that was becoming familiar but no less unsettling. She pressed her fingers against it, feeling the strange warmth that pulsed beneath her skin. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would anyone want to hurt me?" Giles moved around the table to stand beside her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The touch sent electricity through her entire body, a sensation that was part desire and part recognition and part something she had no name for. "Because when you and I are together, we're capable of things that threaten the natural order," he said quietly. "The original Clara discovered abilities she never knew she possessed, powers that could reshape reality itself if properly channeled. And you think I have those same abilities?" "I think you're stronger than the original Clara ever was," he replied, his fingers trailing down her arm to touch the mark on her wrist. "I think you've been tested by hardship and solitude in ways that prepared you for what's coming. And I think the forces that killed her before are terrified of what we might accomplish together." Clara looked between Gail's intense green eyes and Professor Whitehall's concerned expression, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff with no way back to solid ground. "If I agree to this," she said finally, "if I accept that I'm who you think I am and go wherever this journey leads, what guarantee do I have that I won't end up like the original Clara, dead at 21 with nothing to show for my brief life but a tragic love story?" Giles' hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her lower lip with infinite gentleness. "You have my word that I will die before I let anything happen to you. You have my promise that this time, love will be stronger than death." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words resonate in her bones, in her blood, in the mark that burned like a brand on her wrist. When she opened them again, her reflection in the darkened window showed a woman she barely recognized. Elegant, beautiful, powerful in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice steady despite the fear and excitement warring in her chest, "you show me everything. The documents, the records, the truth about who I was and who I'm meant to become." Giles' smile was radiant with relief and joy. "Tomorrow," he agreed, "your real life begins." As Clara prepared for bed in her luxurious guest room, she found herself thinking about the path that had led her from the shadowy corridors of Raven's Hollow Manor to this moment of transformation. Yesterday she had been invisible, unremarkable, forgotten. Tonight she was the center of a story that spanned more than a century, the focal point of forces she didn't understand, but could feel moving around her like tides. The mark on her wrist pulsed with warmth as she drifted off to sleep, and her dreams were filled with images of a love so powerful it had transcended death itself, returning again and again until it found its way home. Clara woke before dawn with the strangest sensation that someone had been watching her sleep. The feeling was so strong that she sat up in the luxurious four-poster bed, her heart hammering as she scanned the shadows of the unfamiliar room. The heavy curtains were drawn tight against the London morning, but she could see nothing out of place, no sign of an intruder. Yet the sensation persisted, prickling along her spine like cold fingers trailing across her skin. She touched the mark on her wrist and gasped. It was burning hot, so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. The intricate symbol seemed to pulse with its own light in the darkness, casting strange shadows on the silk bedsheets. A soft knock at her door made her jump. "Clara?" Giles' voice was low, urgent. "Are you awake?" She pulled a robe around herself, and opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. His dark hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it, and his green eyes held a tension that immediately put her on alert. "Something's wrong," she said, not bothering to make it a question. "We need to leave now." He glanced over his shoulder toward the staircase, then back at her. "Pack quickly, only what you absolutely need. We have perhaps an hour before they find us." "They?" Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "Who are they?" "The same people who killed the original Clara. They found us sooner than I expected." Gail moved into her room, going directly to the wardrobe and pulling out a traveling dress of deep blue wool. "Put this on. The color will help mask your aura from their tracking methods." Clara wanted to demand more explanation, but something in his manner convinced her that questions would have to wait. She dressed quickly, her fingers shaking as she fastened the buttons and pinned her hair back. The mark on her wrist continued to burn, and she found herself cradling it against her chest as if that might somehow ease the pain. "Here." Gail handed her a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. "This will help shield you, but it's not a permanent solution." The pendant was warm against her palm, inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them directly. The moment she fastened it around her neck, the burning sensation in her wrist lessened, though it didn't disappear entirely. "Better?" Gail asked, and Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The pendant made her feel safer, but it also made her more aware of just how much danger they were apparently in. They left the townhouse through a servant's entrance that Clara hadn't known existed, emerging into a narrow mews behind the elegant street. A different car waited for them, older, less conspicuous than the gleaming Bentley. Gail loaded their hastily packed bags, while Clara looked nervously over her shoulder, expecting at any moment to see mysterious figures pursuing them through the London dawn. "The British Library," she said as they pulled away from the curb. "You said we were going there today." "We are, but not in the way I originally planned." Gail navigated through streets that were just beginning to show signs of life. Early commuters, delivery trucks, the gradual awakening of a great city. "Professor Whitehall has arranged for us to access certain restricted collections, documents that aren't available to ordinary researchers." "What kind of documents?" Gail's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Records that prove the existence of the supernatural forces we're dealing with. Historical accounts of other couples like us, other instances of souls being reborn to find each other across centuries, and evidence of the organization that has made it their mission to prevent such reunions." Clara felt cold dread settling in her stomach. "Why would anyone want to prevent true love from transcending death?" "Because love like ours comes with power," he said grimly. "When two souls are perfectly matched, when they find each other again and again across lifetimes, they can access abilities that most humans can't even imagine. We become capable of altering the very fabric of reality, of reshaping the world according to our will." "That sounds—" Clara struggled to find the right words. "Terrifying." "It should, because in the wrong hands that kind of power could destroy everything." Gail glanced at her, his green eyes serious. "But in the right hands, in our hands, it could heal wounds that have festered for centuries, could bring peace to conflicts that seem impossible to resolve, could create a world where love truly does conquer all." The British Library was an imposing structure of red brick and Portland stone, its modern facade somehow managing to convey both accessibility and scholarly gravitas. Professor Whitehall was waiting for them at a staff entrance, looking far more alert than anyone had a right to at such an early hour. "Any trouble getting here?" she asked as she led them through corridors lined with books that stretched up to impossible heights. "Not yet," Gail replied, but Clara noticed the way his eyes constantly moved, scanning their surroundings for threats she couldn't see. "How much time do we have?" "Enough if we move quickly." Professor Whitehall stopped in front of a heavy oak door marked Private Research Collection and produced an ornate brass key. "The documents you need to see are housed in our most secure vault. Items that the general public must never know exist." The room beyond the door was unlike anything Clara had ever seen. Manuscripts lay open in climate-controlled cases, their pages yellow with age, but their text still clearly visible. Maps covered one wall, showing the world as it had been centuries ago, with strange symbols marking locations that didn't correspond to any cities she recognized. And everywhere, scattered across tables and pinned to corkboards, were photographs, dozens of them, all showing couples who looked remarkably similar to Clara and Gail in different historical periods. "My God," Clara breathed, moving closer to examine the pictures. Here was a woman with her face standing beside a man with Gail's distinctive features, both dressed in medieval clothing. There was another pair in Renaissance garb, another in clothing from the American Civil War period, still another from what looked like the 1920s. 43 documented instances over the past 8 centuries, Professor Whitehall said quietly. The same souls finding each other again and again, always recognizable, always devoted to each other with an intensity that defied social convention and often common sense. Clara picked up a photograph dated 1943, showing a young woman in a nurse's uniform standing next to a man in military dress. The resemblance was uncanny, not just similar but identical, as if the same two people had been photographed across different decades. "What happened to them?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Most died young," Professor Whitehall replied, her voice heavy with sadness. "Tragic accidents, sudden illnesses, violent deaths that seemed random, but followed a disturbing pattern. Someone, or some organization, has been systematically preventing these souls from fulfilling their destiny." Gail moved to a display case containing what appeared to be ancient scrolls. "The Brotherhood of Eternal Silence," he said, his voice filled with quiet fury. "They've existed in various forms for over a millennium, always with the same purpose, to prevent supernatural love from achieving its full power." "Why?" Clara asked, though part of her suspected she already knew. "Because they feed on separation, on longing, on the energy created when perfectly matched souls are kept apart," Professor Whitehall explained. "They've built an entire society around harvesting that spiritual anguish, using it to fuel their own dark purposes." Clara felt sick. "And they've been hunting us for centuries." You specifically, no, but couples like you, yes." Gail turned from the scrolls to face her, his expression grim. "The difference is that you and I have advantages the others didn't. We know they exist. We're prepared for their interference, and most importantly, you're stronger than any of your previous incarnations." "How do you know that?" Instead of answering immediately, Gail moved to Clara's side and took her hand, pressing it flat against one of the ancient maps on the wall. The moment her palm made contact with the parchment, Clara gasped as images flooded her mind. Not her own memories, but those of the women who had worn her face in previous lifetimes. She saw herself as a medieval lady, using what could only be described as magic to heal plague victims when conventional medicine failed. She saw herself as a Renaissance artist, painting portraits that somehow captured not just physical appearance but the very essence of the soul. She saw herself as a Civil War nurse, bringing dying soldiers back from the brink of death through sheer force of will and love. "Each time you're reborn," Gail said softly, "you retain more of the accumulated power from your previous lives. The Clara who died in 1871 was already formidable. But you're the culmination of centuries of growth, the repository of abilities that most people couldn't handle without going insane." Clara jerked her hand away from the map, overwhelmed by the flood of memories that weren't her own. "I don't want this," she whispered. "I didn't ask to be some kind of supernatural weapon." "You're not a weapon," Professor Whitehall said firmly. "You're a force for healing, for love, for bringing light to the darkest corners of the world. But that kind of power inevitably attracts those who would corrupt it or destroy it entirely." A distant sound, footsteps in the corridor outside, made all three of them freeze. Gail moved with inhuman speed to the door, pressing his ear against it before turning back to them, with alarm written across his features. "They're here," he said quietly. "Multiple individuals, moving with military precision. We have perhaps 2 minutes before they breach this room." Professor Whitehall was already moving, gathering specific documents from the displays and stuffing them into a leather satchel. "Take these," she said, pressing the bag into Clara's hands. "Everything you need to understand your history and your power is in there. Study them when you have time, but for now you need to run." "What about you?" Clara asked, but the older woman was already shaking her head. "I'm too old to run, my dear. Besides, someone needs to delay them, give you a chance to escape." Professor Whitehall moved to a section of the wall that looked like solid stone, but when she pressed against it in a specific pattern, swung inward to reveal a hidden passage. This leads to the building's old pneumatic tube system. It will take you to the street 2 blocks away. The footsteps in the corridor were getting closer, accompanied now by voices speaking in a language Clara didn't recognize. Gale took her hand, pulling her toward the secret passage, but she resisted. "Professor, please, come with us. Child, I've been running from the Brotherhood for 50 years. So I'm tired." Professor Whitehall smiled sadly. "But you have a chance to end this cycle once and for all. Don't waste it on an old woman's sentiment." The hidden passage was narrow and dark, clearly designed for emergency use rather than comfort. Clara found herself crawling through what felt like ancient stone tunnels, the satchel of documents clutched against her chest, while Gale moved ahead of her with the confidence of someone who had navigated such routes before. Behind them, she could hear sounds that made her blood run cold, shouts of anger, the crash of furniture being overturned, and then a scream that she hoped didn't belong to Professor Whitehall. They emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of a building several streets away from the British Library. Gale helped Clara to her feet, both of them covered in dust and breathing hard from their desperate flight. "Is she—" Clara couldn't finish the question. "Margaret Whitehall is tougher than she looks," Gale said, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "She survived Brotherhood encounters before." They made their way to street level, emerging into the bustle of London morning traffic. To any casual observer, they probably looked like tourists who had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere they didn't belong. Gale hailed a taxi with the practiced ease of someone familiar with the city. "Where to?" the driver asked, and Gale gave him an address that Clara didn't recognize. As they pulled away from the curb, Clara clutched the satchel of documents and tried to process what had just happened. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been a simple housemaid with no past and no future worth mentioning. Now she was apparently the reincarnation of a woman who had died over a century ago, possessed of supernatural powers she didn't understand, and being hunted by an ancient organization that fed on the anguish of separated lovers. "Where are we going now?" she asked as the taxi wove through London traffic. "King's Cross Station," Gale replied. "We're taking the next train to the Lake District. There's someone there who can help us. Someone the Brotherhood has never been able to find or corrupt." "Another professor?" Gile's smile was grim. "Something rather more exotic than that." The train journey north gave Clara her first opportunity to examine the documents Professor Whitehall had risked so much to preserve. The satchel contained photographs, letters, maps, and what appeared to be pages from personal journals, all documenting the tragic history of souls like hers and Gale's. The photographs were the most disturbing, not just because of the uncanny physical resemblance between herself and the women from previous centuries, but because of the pattern they revealed. In every case, the couple appeared happy in early photographs, clearly deeply in love and devoted to each other. But in later images, when they existed at all, there were signs of strain, of fear, of people living under constant threat. The letters were even more heartbreaking. Clara found herself reading love notes that could have been written in her own hand, expressing feelings that resonated in her bones, even though she had no conscious memory of writing them. The recurring themes were always the same: passionate devotion, growing awareness of supernatural abilities, mounting fear of unnamed pursuers, and ultimately, desperate plans for escape that had obviously failed. "This one," she said, holding up a letter dated 1847. "She writes about dreams of a man with green eyes who calls to her across time. She describes him perfectly, not just physically, but his mannerisms, his way of speaking, even the way he laughs." Gile looked up from his own reading. "What else does she say?" Clara scanned the faded handwriting. "That she's been having the dreams since childhood, but they've become more vivid recently. She feels like she's waiting for something but doesn't know what. And," she frowned, trying to decipher a particularly faded passage, "she mentions a mark appearing on her wrist, burning like fire but not quite painful." "Show me your wrist." Clara rolled up her sleeve, revealing the symbol that had appeared 2 days ago. In the natural light streaming through the train window, she could see details that hadn't been visible before. The intertwined key and rose seemed to shift slightly as she watched, the lines rearranging themselves in subtle ways. "It's changing," she said, alarmed. It's responding to proximity, Gale explained. The closer we get to our destination, the more active it becomes. By the time we reach the Lake District, it should be giving you access to abilities you didn't know you possessed. What kind of abilities? That depends on what we encounter. The mark is essentially a conduit. It allows you to draw on power from your previous incarnations when the need arises. In medieval times, that manifested as healing abilities. During the Renaissance, it was artistic inspiration that bordered on supernatural. In more recent centuries, it's been precognition, telepathy, even limited control over natural forces. Clara stared at the mark with new understanding, and not a little fear. "And you've seen all of this before?" 42 times, Gale said quietly. "I've watched you discover your power, watched you learn to control it, watched you use it to help others and protect the innocent. And then I've watched the Brotherhood find ways to corrupt it or destroy it, and you along with it." The pain in his voice was so acute that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "That must be unbearable, to lose the same person over and over again." "It is. But it's also given me something the Brotherhood doesn't expect. Patience, determination, and most importantly, the accumulated knowledge of what doesn't work." Gale's green eyes burned with fierce resolve. "This time will be different, Clara. This time we're going to win." The train pulled into Windermere Station in the late afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the platform. The Lake District was breathtakingly beautiful. Rolling hills covered in forests that were just beginning to show their autumn colors, glimpses of pristine lakes reflecting the sky like mirrors, and an overall sense of peace that was almost palpable. "It's lovely," Clara said as they collected their luggage. "I can see why people come here to think and write." "The Romantics understood something that most people miss," Gale agreed, leading her toward a waiting car. Another vehicle that had been arranged in advance, Clara noticed. Natural beauty isn't just aesthetically pleasing. It's actually a source of power for those who know how to access it. Their destination was a cottage that sat on the shores of Lake Windermere, so perfectly positioned that it seemed to have grown from the landscape rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Clara could see warm light glowing in the windows, giving the place an almost fairy tale quality. "Who lives here?" she asked as they approached the front door. "Someone who's been waiting to meet you for a very long time," Gale replied. But before he could elaborate, the door swung open. The woman who greeted them was perhaps 60, with silver hair that fell in waves to her shoulders, and eyes that seemed to shift color, depending on how the light hit them. She wore flowing clothes in earth tones that emphasized her connection to the natural world around her, and there was something about her presence that immediately put Clara at ease. "So," she said, her voice carrying the soft accent of the region, "this is our young Clara at last. I'm Moira Blackwood, and I've been expecting you for quite some time." "Expecting me?" Moira's smile was mysterious and somehow ancient, despite her relatively youthful appearance. "My dear girl, I helped deliver the original Clara Romanelli in 1850. I was there when she died in 1871, and I've been waiting for her to return ever since." Clara felt the world tilt slightly around her. "That's impossible. You'd have to be 173 years old?" "Yes, I suppose I would." Moira stepped aside to let them enter the cottage. "Come in, both of you. We have a great deal to discuss, and not nearly enough time to waste on disbelief." The interior of the cottage was cozy and filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Every surface seemed to hold books, crystals, dried flowers, or artifacts that Clara couldn't begin to identify. But despite the clutter, there was an underlying order to everything, as if each item had been placed with careful intention. "Sit," Moira said, gesturing to a sofa positioned to take advantage of the view over the lake. "I'll make tea, and then I'll tell you exactly what you're up against, and more importantly, what you can do about it." As Clara settled into the comfortable cushions, she found herself staring out at the lake, watching the way the dying sunlight turned the water to liquid gold. The mark on her wrist had stopped burning entirely, replaced by a gentle warmth that felt like coming home. "This place," she said to Gale, who had taken a seat beside her. "It feels safe." "It is. Moira has protected these shores for longer than most nations have existed. The Brotherhood knows she's here, but they've never been able to breach her defenses." His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as if they had been holding hands for decades. This is where you'll learn to control your abilities, where you'll prepare for what's coming. And what exactly is coming? Moira returned with a tea service that looked like it belonged in a museum, the delicate china decorated with symbols. That seemed to echo the mark on Clara's wrist. The final confrontation, my dear. After 43 failed attempts, the Brotherhood is done playing games. They're going to try to destroy you permanently this time, not just kill your current incarnation, but shatter your soul so completely that you can never be reborn again. Clara felt ice form in her veins. Can they do that? They believe they can. They've been preparing for centuries, gathering power, recruiting allies, developing techniques specifically designed to end your cycle once and for all. Moira poured tea with steady hands, but Clara could see the concern in her shifting eyes. But they don't know about me. They don't know about the training I can give you, the knowledge I can share. Most importantly, they don't know that this incarnation of Clara Romanelli is stronger than all the others combined. As if in response to her words, the mark on Clara's wrist began to glow softly, visible even through her sleeve. She rolled up the fabric and watched in fascination as the symbol seemed to come alive, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. Moira smiled, and for the first time since Clara had met her, the expression was one of pure joy. "You're awakening, my dear. Finally, completely irrevocably awakening to who you truly are." Outside the cottage windows, the lake began to glow with the same soft light as Clara's mark, as if the very landscape was responding to her transformation. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible but definitely present, came the sound of voices singing in harmony, not human voices, but something far older and more mysterious. Clara looked at Gale, at Moira, at the impossible beauty surrounding them, and felt a power stirring within her that was both terrifying and wonderful. Whatever was coming, whatever the Brotherhood had planned, she would be ready. This time love would indeed conquer all. Clara's training began at dawn the next morning, when Moira woke her with a gentle touch and led her down to the lake shore while mist still clung to the water like gossamer veils. The older woman moved with a grace that belied her claimed age, her bare feet making no sound on the dew-wet grass. "Power without understanding is destruction waiting to happen," Moira said as they reached the water's edge. "Before you can access the full extent of your abilities, you must learn to recognize them, to channel them, to control them absolutely." The lake stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the pale sky and distant mountains with such perfect clarity that it was difficult to tell where reality ended and reflection began. Clara could feel something stirring within her, responding to the proximity of so much natural beauty and ancient power. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the nervousness fluttering in her chest. "Nothing at first. Simply exist. Feel the energy around you. Not just the physical world, but the spiritual currents that flow beneath and through everything." Moira gestured toward the water. "Walk with me." They moved along the shoreline, their feet leaving prints in sand that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Clara found herself becoming aware of sensations she had never noticed before. The way the air itself seemed to hum with barely contained energy. The manner in which the trees appeared to lean toward her, as if seeking her attention. The strange warmth that emanated from the very ground beneath her feet. "You feel it," Moira observed, watching Clara's face with keen interest. "The awakening has progressed further than I expected. Usually it takes several days for a new incarnation to become sensitive to the spiritual realm." Clara paused, her hand moving instinctively to the mark on her wrist. It was warm again, pulsing gently in rhythm with her heartbeat, and she could swear she saw tendrils of soft light emanating from beneath her sleeve. "Something's happening to me," she said, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the symbol. It was definitely glowing now, the intricate lines of the key and rose seeming to move and shift as she watched. "Yes," Moira said with satisfaction, "and it's happening much faster than ever before. Show me what you can do." "I don't know what I can do." "Then let's find out." Moira picked up a smooth stone from the beach and placed it in Clara's palm. "Focus on the stone, not with your eyes or your mind, but with whatever is stirring inside you. Let that energy flow through you and into the object." Clara stared down at the stone, feeling rather foolish. It looked like any other pebble one might find on a beach. Grey, worn smooth by countless years of water and weather, utterly ordinary. But as she held it, as she allowed herself to truly focus on it rather than simply looking at it, something extraordinary began to happen. The stone grew warm in her palm, then warmer still. Light began to emanate from within it, as if she were holding a tiny star rather than a piece of rock. The glow intensified until Clara had to squint to look at it directly. And when she finally opened her hand completely, the stone rose into the air, floating several inches above her palm while radiating light that rivaled the morning sun. "My God," Clara breathed, watching in fascination as the stone danced through the air in response to her unconscious will. "You're God indeed," Moira said with a smile that was equal parts pride and concern. "In 42 previous lifetimes, it took weeks for you to achieve levitation. This time you did it in minutes." The stone settled back into Clara's palm as her concentration wavered, its glow fading to a gentle warmth. "Why is this time different?" "Because each incarnation builds upon the last. You're not starting from nothing, Clara. You're drawing on centuries of accumulated power and experience. The original Clara was formidable, but she was also innocent, unprepared for what she was capable of. You've been tempered by hardship, shaped by loss, made strong by survival." Moira took the stone from Clara's hand and tossed it back into the lake. "You're not just Clara Romanelli returned to life. You're Clara Romanelli perfected." They spent the morning working on basic energy manipulation, making flowers bloom out of season, coaxing birds to land on Clara's outstretched hands, causing the lake water to form impossible shapes that defied gravity. With each exercise, Clara felt more connected to the power flowing through her, more aware of the vast potential that lay just beneath her conscious mind. But it was exhausting work. By midday, she was trembling with fatigue, her clothes soaked with perspiration despite the cool autumn air. Moira led her back to the cottage, where Gale was waiting with food and concern written across his handsome features. "You look like you've been running a marathon," he said, helping Clara into a chair and pressing a cup of tea into her hands. "It feels like it," Clara admitted, grateful for the warmth of the drink and the solid comfort of his presence. "Moira says I'm progressing faster than any of my previous incarnations, which is both encouraging and dangerous," Gale said, his green eyes serious. "The faster you develop your abilities, the more quickly the Brotherhood will be able to track you. Power like yours creates ripples in the spiritual realm, ripples they've learned to detect and follow." As if summoned by his words, a chill wind suddenly swept across the lake, rattling the cottage windows and causing the trees to bend and sway, despite the previously calm conditions. Clara felt the mark on her wrist begin to burn, and the teacup in her hands grew so hot that she had to set it down quickly to avoid being scalded. "They're here," Moira said grimly, moving to the window to peer out at the lake. "Sooner than I expected, but not unexpectedly." Clara joined her at the window and gasped at what she saw. The perfect mirror of the lake was now churning with unnatural waves, and shapes moved beneath the surface. Not fish or natural aquatic life, but something far more sinister. Dark figures seemed to writhe just below the waterline, and the very air above the lake shimmered with heat distortion, despite the cool temperature. "What are they?" Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Scouts," Gale said, moving to stand behind her. "The Brotherhood doesn't always work through human agents. They have other resources at their disposal." "How long do we have?" "Hours, perhaps less." Moira moved away from the window, her expression grim but determined. "Clara, I had hoped to give you weeks of training to prepare you gradually for what's to come. But circumstances have forced our hand. We are going to have to accelerate your awakening dramatically." "What does that mean?" "It means pain," Moira said bluntly. "It means risking your sanity, as centuries of accumulated power and memory flood through you all at once. It means trusting in love to anchor you to this reality when everything else becomes uncertain." Clara looked between Moira's concerned face and Gale's anguished expression. "And if we don't do it?" "Then the Brotherhood captures you before you're strong enough to defend yourself, and this cycle of death and separation continues for another century or more." Moira moved to a cabinet that Clara hadn't noticed before, withdrawing what appeared to be an ornate silver chalice. "The choice is yours, my dear. But choose quickly. I can feel them getting closer." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on her. Somewhere deep inside her mind, she could sense the presence of all the women who had worn her face, lived her life, loved Gale with the same desperate intensity that even now threatened to overwhelm her completely. They were all there waiting, urging her to be brave, to take the risk they had never been strong enough to take. "Do it," she said, opening her eyes to meet Gale's worried gaze. "Whatever needs to be done, do it now." Moira nodded and began preparing what was clearly some sort of ritual. She filled the chalice with water from the lake, added herbs and other substances that Clara couldn't identify, and began speaking in a language that sounded ancient beyond measure. The cottage filled with the scent of ozone and burning metal, and the very air seemed to thicken with power. "The awakening ritual is dangerous for both participants," Moira explained as she worked. "Clara, you'll be opening yourself to the full weight of your accumulated incarnations. Gale, you'll be serving as her anchor, keeping her soul tethered to this reality when the influx of memory and power threatens to scatter it across multiple lifetimes. If either of you falters, if the connection between you breaks even for an instant, Clara could be lost forever. What do we need to do?" Gale asked, already moving to Clara's side. "Drink from the chalice together. Let the ritual bond you on every level, physical, emotional, spiritual. And then trust in the love that has survived 43 lifetimes to see you through." Moira held out the chalice, its contents now glowing with soft silver light. "But know this, once begun, the process cannot be stopped or reversed. You will both be changed by what happens next." Clara took the chalice with hands that trembled only slightly. The liquid inside smelled of storms and starlight, of ancient forests and sacred springs. When she looked into its depths, she saw not her own reflection, but the faces of all her previous incarnations, each one nodding encouragement. "Together," Gale said softly, his hands covering hers on the chalice's stem. "Together," Clara agreed, and they drank. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Clara felt her consciousness explode outward, fragmenting across dozens of lifetimes simultaneously. She was the medieval healer, using power drawn from the earth itself to cure plague victims. She was the Renaissance artist, painting portraits that captured souls as well as faces. She was the Victorian wife, dying in childbirth but pouring her love into the spiritual realm to ensure her eventual return. Each incarnation brought its own memories, its own abilities, its own accumulated wisdom and power. Clara felt herself becoming more than human, more than mortal, transformed into something that existed partially in the physical world and partially in realms beyond ordinary perception. Through it all, Gale's presence anchored her, his love serving as a lighthouse guiding her back to herself whenever the flood of memory and sensation threatened to sweep her away entirely. She could feel his mind touching hers, his soul intertwined with hers so completely that she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. "Stay with me," he whispered, though she heard his voice not with her ears, but directly in her consciousness. "Come back to me, Clara. Come back to this life, this moment, this love." Gradually, painfully, Clara began to integrate the disparate pieces of herself into a coherent whole. The knowledge and abilities of 43 lifetimes settled into her consciousness like sediment in still water, available when needed, but not overwhelming her with their intensity. When she finally opened her eyes, she was lying on the cottage floor with her head in Gale's lap, his hands stroking her hair with infinite tenderness. But everything was different now. She could see the spiritual energy flowing through the cottage like luminous rivers, could sense Moira's ancient power like a warm hearthfire, could feel the malevolent presence of the Brotherhood scouts growing stronger by the moment. "How do you feel?" Gale asked, his voice rough with concern and exhaustion. Clara sat up slowly, marveling at the way her body moved with perfect grace, every gesture flowing with unconscious power. "Different," she said, and even her voice carried new harmonics, new depths. "Complete." She raised her hand and watched silver light flow from her fingertips, responding to her will with effortless precision. The mark on her wrist now glowed constantly, its intricate pattern serving as a focal point for abilities that spanned centuries of accumulated wisdom. "The Brotherhood scouts are almost at the shore," Moira said urgently. "We need to move you to a more secure location before—" Her words were cut off by an explosion of sound and fury as something massive struck the cottage from above. The roof splintered and buckled, showering them with debris as dark shapes poured through the breach. Clara got her first clear look at the Brotherhood's inhuman agents, creatures that might once have been human, but had been twisted by dark magic into something else entirely. They moved with predatory grace, their eyes burning with unholy light, their fingers ending in claws that could shred flesh from bone. But what was most disturbing was their faces, beautiful, achingly familiar, wearing expressions of love and longing that made Clara's heart clench with recognition. "They're using the faces of our past incarnations," Gale snarled, moving to place himself between Clara and the advancing creatures. "They're trying to confuse us, to make us hesitate." "It won't work," Clara said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. Power flowed through her like wine, intoxicating and dangerous. "I know who I am now. I know what I'm capable of." She raised her hands and silver fire erupted from her palms, washing over the nearest creature. It shrieked and dissolved into shadow and ash, its false face melting away to reveal the corruption beneath. But there were more behind it, pouring through the breach in the roof like a dark tide. The battle that followed was unlike anything Clara could have imagined even in her strangest dreams. She moved with the accumulated skill of 43 lifetimes, wielding power that bent reality around her will. She spoke words in languages that had been old when the pyramids were young, commanded forces that existed at the very foundation of creation. But the creatures kept coming, wave after wave of twisted shadows wearing beloved faces. And behind them, Clara began to sense a presence that was far more dangerous than any mere scout or foot soldier. "There's someone else," she called to Gale as she incinerated another attacker. "Someone controlling them. Someone—" The cottage door exploded inward, and a figure stepped through the wreckage that made Clara's blood freeze in her veins. It was herself, or rather another woman who shared her face, her build, her coloring. But where Clara's eyes held warmth and compassion, this other's burned with cold hatred. Where Clara's expression showed love and determination, this one displayed only jealousy and rage. "Hello, sister," the newcomer said, her voice a perfect mirror of Clara's own, but touched with poison. "I've been waiting so long to meet you again." Clara felt recognition slam into her like a physical blow, not from this lifetime, but from the accumulated memories of previous incarnations. This woman had appeared before in other centuries, in other conflicts, always wearing a different face, but always carrying the same spiritual signature, the same toxic jealousy. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, though part of her already knew. "I'm what you could have become," the woman replied, moving into the cottage with predatory grace. "I'm the shadow to your light, the darkness to balance your insufferable brightness. I'm your twin soul, Clara, the one who was separated from you at the moment of original creation, condemned to love the same man you love, to want the same life you want, but never to have either." Understanding crashed over Clara like a cold wave. "You're why the other incarnations failed. You're the one who's been helping the Brotherhood." "Helping them?" The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear sister, I am them. The Brotherhood of Eternal Silence exists because I created it. Because I needed mortal agents to do what I couldn't accomplish alone, keeping you and Gale apart, so that eventually he might turn to me instead." Gale stepped forward, his face a mask of fury and disgust. "Lilith, I should have known." "You remember me now," Lilith purred, her attention shifting to him with naked hunger. "Do you remember how I loved you, Gale? How I offered myself to you again and again, only to watch you choose her every single time?" "Because she is my other half," Gale said firmly. "She is the completion of my soul, the answer to every question I've ever had about love and purpose and meaning. You are nothing but jealousy given form, hatred wearing a beautiful mask." Lilith's expression twisted with rage, and Clara felt the very air around them begin to crackle with malevolent energy. "Then you both deserve what's coming. I've spent centuries preparing for this moment, gathering power, learning the true names of death and separation. This time, when I destroy her, it will be permanent. This time she won't be coming back." The battle that erupted then made the previous fight with the shadow creatures seem like a mere skirmish. Lilith wielded power that was the dark mirror of Clara's abilities, drawing on centuries of accumulated hatred and jealousy to fuel attacks that shattered the cottage walls and set the very lake on fire with unnatural flames. Clara found herself fighting not just for her life, but for her soul, for the continuation of a love that had endured across lifetimes. Every spell she cast was met by an equal and opposite force from Lilith. Every moment of triumph was balanced by a moment of near defeat. But as the battle raged, Clara began to understand something that Lilith had missed in all her centuries of planning. The power that flowed through her wasn't just her own. It was shared with Gale, channeled through their bond, amplified by their love. Where Lilith fought alone, consumed by isolation and jealousy, Clara fought as part of something larger than herself. "Now, Gale," she called, seeing her opportunity as Lilith overextended herself in a particularly vicious attack. Together, they combined their power, Clara's accumulated abilities and Gale's own supernatural nature, into a force that was greater than the sum of its parts. Silver and gold light erupted from their joined hands, washing over Lilith with the power of every love story that had ever ended in triumph rather than tragedy. Lilith shrieked as the light touched her, her false beauty melting away to reveal the corrupted spirit beneath. "This isn't over," she snarled as her form began to dissolve. "Love may have won this battle, but the war continues across eternity. I will find another way, another time, another—" Her words were cut off as she finally crumbled into ash and shadow, dispersing on a wind that carried the scent of roses and redemption. Clara collapsed into Gale's arms, exhausted but victorious. Around them, the cottage lay in ruins. But outside the shattered windows, the lake had returned to its pristine beauty, reflecting the evening sky with perfect serenity. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This part is," Moira said, emerging from the wreckage with cuts on her face but triumph in her eyes. "Lilith is gone, not just defeated but purified, and the brotherhood she created will crumble without her guidance. What happens now?" Gale helped Clara to her feet, his hands gentle but possessive as they traced the curve of her face. "Now we live," he said simply. "We have the rest of this lifetime and the next, and the one after that. We have eternity, Clara, and we're finally free to spend it together." As the sun set over Lake Windermere, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara felt a peace settle over her that she had been searching for across multiple lifetimes. The power still flowed through her, would always be part of who she was, but it no longer felt like a burden or a curse. It felt like a gift, the gift of being strong enough to protect what mattered most, wise enough to use her abilities for good, and loved enough to remember who she truly was, no matter what challenges the future might bring. "I love you," she whispered against Gale's lips as he bent to kiss her. "I love you too," he replied. "In this life and every life to come." And as their lips met in a kiss that tasted of triumph and eternity, Clara knew that some stories really do have happy endings. They just sometimes take a few centuries to reach them. That night, as they made love in the ruins of the cottage, with starlight streaming through the broken roof, Clara finally understood what it meant to be complete. Every touch was recognition, every caress a homecoming, every whispered endearment, a promise that had been centuries in the making. She was no longer the invisible housemaid or the frightened girl running from forces she didn't understand. She was Clara Romanelli in full, powerful, beloved, and finally free to claim the life that had always been meant to be hers. The mark on her wrist glowed softly in the darkness, no longer a brand or a burden, but a symbol of love that had conquered death itself. And as sleep finally claimed her in Gale's arms, Clara smiled, knowing that this time their story would have no ending at all, only an eternal beginning. Clara woke to the sound of workmen's voices and the rhythmic hammering of construction. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. She was lying in an unfamiliar bed, in a room filled with morning light that seemed to dance with otherworldly energy. Then memory flooded back, the battle with Lilith, the triumph of their love, the destruction of Moira's cottage, and the profound transformation that had left her feeling like an entirely different person inhabiting the same body. She sat up slowly, marveling at how her body moved with newfound grace and strength. The mark on her wrist had settled into a steady, warm glow that no longer caused pain, but instead felt like a constant reminder of the power flowing through her veins. Through the tall windows, she could see men in work clothes clearing away the debris from the cottage, their movements efficient and purposeful. They started at dawn. Gale's voice came from the doorway, rich with affection, and something deeper, a satisfaction that spoke of desires finally fulfilled after centuries of waiting. Moira insisted that the cottage be rebuilt exactly as it was, but with improvements to handle future supernatural incursions. Clara turned to look at him, and her breath caught in her throat as it did every time she saw him now. With her awakened abilities came a new way of seeing, and when she looked at Gale, she could perceive not just his physical form, but the luminous energy that surrounded him like an aura. He was beautiful in ways that transcended the merely human, and the love that flowed between them was visible to her enhanced senses as golden threads connecting their souls. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, stretching luxuriously beneath the silk sheets. 14 hours. Moira said it was normal. Your body needed time to fully integrate the awakening. He moved into the room with predatory grace, wearing nothing but dark trousers that emphasized the lean strength of his frame. "She's prepared breakfast for us, and then we need to discuss our future." Clara felt a flicker of concern. "Our future?" Gale sat on the edge of the bed, his hand finding hers automatically. The simple touch sent electricity through her entire body. Desire and love and recognition, all mingling into something that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. "With Lilith gone and the Brotherhood broken, we're free for the first time in centuries," he explained, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that made her shiver with want. "But that freedom comes with choices we've never had to make before. Where do we live? How do we use your abilities? What do we do with the rest of our very long lives?" The questions were both thrilling and daunting. Clara had spent so much of her existence simply trying to survive, to remain invisible, to avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention. The idea that she could now choose her own path, that she had someone who would walk beside her no matter what direction she chose, was intoxicating. "I don't know," she admitted. "Yesterday I was a housemaid with no past and no future. Today what am I exactly?" Gale's smile was tender and proud. "You're Clara Romanelli, keeper of ancient wisdom, wielder of powers that most people can't even imagine, and the woman I've loved across 43 lifetimes. You're also the single most dangerous individual in England, capable of reshaping reality with a thought and a gesture. That's terrifying. It should be. But you're also the most compassionate person I've ever known, in this life or any other. Your power will never be used for selfish gain or petty revenge. It will be a force for healing, for protection, for making the world a better place." His hand cupped her cheek, and Clara leaned into the touch with a sigh of contentment. "That's what makes you extraordinary, Clara. Not the magic, but the heart that guides it." They dressed together, and Clara was struck by the intimacy of the simple act. In her previous incarnations, their time together had always been cut short by tragedy or interference. Now for the first time they could enjoy the small, domestic pleasures of a shared life, helping each other with buttons, stealing kisses while searching for missing stockings, the gentle teasing that came naturally to lovers who knew each other's habits and preferences. The temporary shelter that had been erected near the cottage ruins was surprisingly comfortable, with a sitting area that looked out over the lake and a kitchen where Moira was preparing what smelled like the most elaborate breakfast Clara had ever encountered. "Good morning, my dear," the older woman said with a smile that was both maternal and slightly mysterious. "I trust you slept well? The awakening can be quite exhausting, especially when it happens as rapidly as yours did." "I feel different," Clara said, settling into a chair beside the window. "Everything looks sharper, more vivid. I can see things that weren't visible before." "Your perception has expanded to include the spiritual realm," Moira explained, setting plates of food before them that looked too beautiful to eat. "What you're seeing now is how the world truly exists, layered with energy and meaning that most humans never suspect." Clara looked out at the lake and gasped. What had appeared to be ordinary water now shimmered with currents of light, and she could see shapes moving beneath the surface that were definitely not fish. "There are beings in the lake. Water spirits, nature elementals, the souls of those who died peacefully near these shores. The Lake District has always been a thin place between worlds," Moira said matter-of-factly. "They're harmless mostly. Curious about you, certainly. It's not often they encounter someone with your level of ability." As if responding to her attention, several translucent figures rose partially from the water. their forms shifting between human and something more abstract. They watched Clara with what appeared to be benevolent interest before sinking back beneath the surface. "Will it always be like this?" Clara asked. "Will I always see the supernatural overlay on the ordinary world?" "You can learn to filter it when necessary," Moira assured her. "But why would you want to? You're seeing the world as it truly is, in all its layered complexity and hidden beauty. Most people go through their entire lives only perceiving a fraction of what actually exists around them." Breakfast was a leisurely affair, with Moira regaling them with stories of the Lake District's supernatural history and the various magical practitioners who had made their homes in the region over the centuries. Clara found herself relaxing in a way she never had before, feeling truly safe and accepted for the first time in her life. It was as they were finishing their meal that the first visitor arrived. Clara sensed her before she appeared, a presence, approaching across the lake with purpose and power that made the mark on Clara's wrist tingle with recognition. A woman emerged from the morning mist, walking across the surface of the water as if it were solid ground, her long silver hair flowing behind her like a banner. "Lady Evangeline," Moira said, rising from her chair with obvious respect. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." The woman who stepped onto the shore was ageless in the way that only truly powerful magical beings could be. She might have been 30 or 300, with features that spoke of otherworldly beauty and eyes that held the depths of ancient forests. "News travels quickly in our circles," Lady Evangeline said, her voice carrying the refined accent of the British aristocracy. "The destruction of Lilith and the collapse of the Brotherhood has sent shockwaves through the supernatural community. Everyone wants to know what the newly awakened Clara Romanelli plans to do with her considerable abilities." Clara felt a flutter of nervousness. "Everyone? Every magical practitioner in Europe, every supernatural being with an interest in the balance of power, every government agency that monitors paranormal activity," Lady Evangeline replied, studying Clara with keen interest. "You've become quite famous, my dear. The woman who broke a cycle that had persisted for 8 centuries, who defeated one of the most dangerous entities in the spiritual realm, who now possesses power that rivals the ancient mages. You're rather a celebrity." "I don't want to be famous," Clara said quickly. "I just want to live peacefully with Gale." "I'm afraid that may not be entirely possible," Lady Evangeline said gently. "Power like yours cannot remain hidden, and with great ability comes great responsibility. There are situations in the world that require supernatural intervention, problems that only someone with your unique combination of abilities can solve." Gale leaned forward, his expression protective. "Are you asking Clara to become some sort of supernatural problem solver?" "I'm asking her to consider using her gifts for the greater good," Lady Evangeline clarified. "The Council of Mages has authorized me to offer her a position, nothing demanding, nothing that would require her to leave England or separate her from her beloved, simply the occasional consultation when situations arise that require her particular expertise." Clara considered the offer, feeling the weight of centuries of accumulated wisdom pressing against her consciousness. She could sense the truth in Lady Evangeline's words. There were indeed problems in the world that only supernatural intervention could solve. Suffering that her abilities could ease, darkness that her light could dispel. "What kind of situations?" she asked. "Hauntings that have turned malevolent and threaten innocent lives. Cursed objects that need to be safely contained or destroyed. Occasionally individuals who have dabbled in dark magic and need to be redirected before they cause serious harm." Lady Evangeline's expression grew serious. "The supernatural world has its share of problems, Clara, and most humans are completely unaware of the dangers that exist just beyond their perception." Clara looked at Gale, reading the conflict in his green eyes. Part of him wanted to keep her safely hidden away, where nothing could threaten their newly found happiness. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with her compassionate heart across multiple lifetimes, understood that asking her to ignore suffering she could prevent would be like asking her to stop breathing. "I won't take on anything too dangerous," Clara said finally, "and Gale comes with me to every consultation." Lady Evangeline's smile was radiant with approval. "I wouldn't dream of asking you to work separately. Your combined abilities are part of what makes you so effective." "Combined abilities?" Clara asked. "Oh yes, my dear. Did you think Gale's immortality was merely a side effect of losing you repeatedly? He's quite powerful in his own right, able to manipulate time and space in limited ways, to see through illusions, to protect against psychic attacks. Together you're nearly unstoppable. Clara felt a thrill of excitement mixed with trepidation. The idea of working together, of using their abilities to help others and make a difference in the world, appealed to her in ways that simple domestic happiness couldn't quite match. Their first assignment came sooner than expected. 3 days after Lady Evangeline's visit, as Clara was settling into a routine of morning training sessions with Moira and afternoons exploring her new abilities with Gale, a desperate message arrived by way of a raven that spoke in human voices. "Please," the bird said in a voice hoarse with grief and exhaustion, "my daughter is dying and the doctors can do nothing. They say it's a wasting disease, but I know better. She's been cursed, and the curse is killing her slowly. Please, if you have any compassion, come to Blackwood Manor in Yorkshire. I'll pay anything, do anything if you can save her." The message was from Lord Edmund Blackwood, a name that Clara recognized from her research into English aristocracy. The Blackwoods were an old family, wealthy and influential, with a reputation for eccentricity that often masked involvement in the supernatural. "We have to help her," Clara said immediately, already mentally preparing for the journey. "Of course we do," Gale agreed, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "But we need to be careful. Curses that target children are usually the work of someone with serious magical ability and questionable morals." The journey to Yorkshire took them back through familiar territory, past Ravenshollow Manor where Clara's journey had begun. She felt like a completely different person from the invisible housemaid who had cleaned those halls just weeks ago, though part of her marveled at how quickly her life had been transformed. Blackwood Manor was a sprawling Georgian estate that spoke of generations of wealth and privilege, but as their car approached the main house, Clara could see the spiritual sickness that hung over the property like a poisonous cloud. Dark energy writhed around the building, and she could hear whispers in languages that predated human civilization. Lord Blackwood met them at the door, a man in his 50s, whose aristocratic bearing couldn't entirely hide his desperate fear for his daughter. "Miss Romanelli, Mr. Romanelli, thank you for coming so quickly. I wasn't certain you would agree to help." "Of course we would help," Clara said gently. "Tell us about your daughter." "Sophia is 12 years old, bright as a star and twice as beautiful," Lord Blackwood said, leading them through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. 3 weeks ago she began having nightmares. Then she stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped responding to anyone or anything. The physicians are baffled. Her body is perfectly healthy, but something is draining the life from her spirit." He led them to a nursery that had been converted into a makeshift sick room. The child lying in the bed broke Clara's heart. She was indeed beautiful, with golden hair and delicate features, but her skin was pale as parchment, and she lay so still that Clara had to look closely to see the rise and fall of her chest. More disturbing than the girl's condition was the supernatural presence that clung to her like a shroud. Clara could see tendrils of dark energy wrapped around the child, feeding on her life force with vampiric hunger. "This is definitely a curse," she said grimly, "but it's unlike anything I've seen before. The magic is extremely sophisticated, designed to be almost undetectable, while slowly draining her life essence. Can you break it?" Lord Blackwood asked desperately. Clara studied the curse more closely, allowing her enhanced perception to analyze its structure and components. What she found made her blood run cold. "This curse is powered by willing sacrifice," she said slowly. "Someone gave up something precious, probably years of their own life, to fuel this kind of sustained magical attack. Whoever cast this curse really wanted your daughter to suffer." "But why would anyone want to hurt a child?" "That's what we need to find out," Gale said, moving to stand beside the bed. "Clara, can you trace the curse back to its source?" Clara placed her hands gently on the girl's forehead, feeling the child's spirit flicker weakly beneath the curse's influence. With careful precision, she began to follow the dark energy back along its path, tracing it like following a thread through a maze. What she found at the other end made her gasp with shock and recognition. The curse originated from someone inside the house, someone who had access to the child, who knew her routines and habits, who could work the magic slowly and subtly over time. And the spiritual signature was familiar. Not someone Clara had met in this lifetime, but someone she recognized from the accumulated memories of previous incarnations. "Lord Blackwood," she said carefully, "I need you to tell me about your household staff, particularly anyone who might have been with your family for a long time, anyone who might have reasons to resent your daughter." Lord Blackwood's face went pale. You think someone in my own house is doing this to Sophia? I think someone who loves you very much is trying to eliminate what they see as competition for your affection," Clara said gently. "The curse is powered by jealousy and possessive love, emotions strong enough to fuel dark magic for weeks." Understanding dawned in Lord Blackwood's eyes, followed immediately by horror. "Mrs. Hartwell, she's been our housekeeper for 20 years, since before Sophia was born. She never married, devoted her entire life to caring for this house for me. But surely she wouldn't." "Unrequited love can twist into something very dark when it's allowed to fester for decades," Gail said grimly. "Especially if the person feels that their devotion has gone unnoticed and unappreciated." Clara was already moving toward the door. "Where would we find Mrs. Hartwell at this time of day?" "The kitchen, most likely. But please be gentle with her. Whatever she's done, she's been part of this family for—" "She's killing your daughter," Clara said firmly. "Whatever else she may have been to your family. Right now she's a threat that needs to be neutralized immediately." They found Mrs. Hartwell in the kitchen, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and the efficient movements of someone who had run a household for decades. She looked up when they entered, and Clara saw recognition flicker in her eyes. Not of Clara herself, but of what Clara represented. "You're here about the child," Mrs. Hartwell said calmly, not bothering to deny or dissemble. "I wondered when someone would finally see through the facade." "Why?" Clara asked simply. "Why hurt an innocent child?" Mrs. Hartwell's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperate loneliness beneath. "She was taking him away from me. Every year he paid less attention to the house, to me, to everything that really mattered. All he could see was that perfect little girl with her golden hair and pretty smiles. I gave him my entire life, and she was going to steal him away with her mere existence. So you decided to kill her." "I decided to free him from her influence," Mrs. Hartwell corrected. "Once she was gone, he would see how much he needed me, how much I had always been there for him." Clara felt sick at the twisted logic, at the way obsessive love had been perverted into something murderous and destructive. But she also felt the power flowing through her, ready to be used to save an innocent life and prevent further tragedy. "End the curse," she said quietly. "Now." "I don't think so," Mrs. Hartwell replied, and Clara felt dark energy beginning to gather around the older woman. "You may be powerful, Miss Romanelli, but I've had 20 years to perfect my craft. This kitchen has been my laboratory, this house my territory. You're the intruder here." The battle that followed was brief but intense. Mrs. Hartwell had indeed developed considerable magical ability over the years, fueled by decades of unrequited love and resentment. But her power was narrow, focused solely on domestic magic and subtle curses designed to avoid detection. Clara, by contrast, had the accumulated knowledge and ability of 43 lifetimes backing her up. She didn't just break Mrs. Hartwell's attacks, she unraveled them, tracing each spell back to its source and dismantling the entire magical structure the housekeeper had built over 2 decades. When it was over, Mrs. Hartwell lay unconscious on the kitchen floor, her magical abilities burned out, and her mind mercifully blanked of the obsessive thoughts that had driven her to attempted murder. She would recover, but she would never again be capable of the focused malice that had powered her curse. Clara rushed back to the nursery, where she found Sophia sitting up in bed, color already returning to her cheeks. The dark energy that had been draining her life was gone, dissipated when its source was eliminated. "Papa?" the girl said weakly, reaching for her father with trembling hands. Lord Blackwood gathered his daughter into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here, darling. You're safe now. You're going to be perfectly fine." As they prepared to leave Blackwood Manor, Lord Blackwood pressed a substantial payment into Clara's hands, despite her protests. "Please," he said quietly. "It's not just for saving Sophia's life, though that alone is worth everything I own. It's for showing me how blind I was, how my kindness to Mrs. Hartwell was actually cruelty, because it gave her hope where none should have existed. I'll make sure she gets proper care, medical help for her mind, but she'll never again be in a position to hurt anyone." During the journey back to the Lake District, Clara found herself reflecting on their first case and what it meant for their future. They had indeed made a difference, saved an innocent life, prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed multiple people. But the experience had also shown her the dark side of the supernatural world they were choosing to engage with. "Are you having second thoughts?" Gail asked, apparently reading her mood. "No," Clara said slowly, "but I'm beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that Lady Evangeline mentioned. We're not just dealing with academic magical theory or ancient curses from history books. We're dealing with real people whose pain and obsession and desperation can manifest as genuine threats to innocent lives. Does that frighten you?" Clara considered the question seriously. "It should. But mostly it makes me grateful that we have the ability to help, that we can be the ones standing between the darkness and the people who would be hurt by it." Gail's hand found hers, warm and reassuring. "That's what I love about you, Clara. In any lifetime, in any incarnation, your first instinct is always to protect and heal rather than to use your power for personal gain." What happens next? Next, we go home to our temporarily rebuilt cottage. We help Moira finish the magical protections she's installing, and we wait for the next call for help. Gail's smile was soft with contentment. And in between cases, we live the quiet domestic life we never got to have in previous incarnations. We read books by the fire. We take long walks around the lake. We make love under the stars, and we remember what it feels like to be truly happy. Clara felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. After so many lifetimes of tragedy and separation, the promise of simple happiness felt like the most precious gift imaginable. "I love you," she said, the words carrying the weight of centuries of devotion. "I love you too," he replied, "forever and always in this life and every life to come." As their car wound through the familiar landscape of the Lake District, Clara watched the sun set over the mountains and felt a deep sense of rightness settle into her bones. She was no longer the invisible housemaid who had cleaned Raven's Hollow Manor in careful silence. She was Clara Romanelli, powerful and beloved, finally free to live the life she had been meant to live all along. The mark on her wrist pulsed gently with warm light, no longer a symbol of awakening, but a reminder of the love that had conquered death itself and the responsibility that came with great power. And as they approached the cottage where Moira waited with dinner and stories of the supernatural visitors who had been asking about them, Clara smiled, knowing that this was only the beginning of their eternal love story. Whatever challenges the future might bring, whatever calls for help might come their way, they would face them together. And that, Clara thought, was the most beautiful magic of all. 6 months had passed since Clara's awakening, and the cottage on Lake Windermere had become more than just a home. It had become a sanctuary for love that had finally found its eternal resting place. The rebuilt structure was both familiar and transformed, enhanced with protections that Moira had woven into its very foundations, making it impervious to supernatural threats while maintaining the cozy warmth that made it feel like the heart of their new life together. Clara stood at the kitchen window on a crisp March morning, watching Gail tend to the garden they had planted together. Spring was arriving early this year, and she suspected her presence might have something to do with the flowers, blooming weeks ahead of schedule. Her abilities had settled into a natural rhythm, no longer the overwhelming flood of power that had nearly consumed her during the awakening, but a steady, warm current that flowed through every aspect of their daily life. The mark on her wrist had evolved too, becoming less a symbol of awakening and more a badge of belonging. It pulsed gently in rhythm with Gail's heartbeat when he was near, a constant reminder of the connection that bound them across lifetimes. Sometimes in quiet moments, she would trace its intricate lines and remember the frightened housemaid she had once been, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this place of perfect contentment. Their work with the Council of Mages had brought them to every corner of Britain, from the misty highlands of Scotland to the ancient stone circles of Cornwall. Each case had taught Clara something new about her abilities, about the hidden world that existed alongside ordinary human life, about the responsibility that came with power beyond most people's comprehension. They had banished malevolent spirits from a Victorian mansion in Bath, restored a cursed forest in Wales to its natural state, and helped a young witch in Manchester learn to control abilities that were manifesting in dangerous ways. Each success had deepened Clara's understanding of who she was meant to be, not just Gale's eternal love, but a guardian standing between the darkness and those too innocent to protect themselves. But perhaps more importantly, each case had strengthened the bond between her and Gale, showing them how perfectly they complemented each other. Where Clara's power burned bright and passionate, Gale's was steady and protective. Where her instincts led her to heal and nurture, his guided him to shield and defend. Together, they had become something greater than the sum of their individual abilities. The sound of hooves on gravel interrupted Clara's morning reverie. She looked up to see a rider approaching at considerable speed, and even from a distance, she could sense the urgency in the figure's bearing. As the rider drew closer, Clara recognized Lady Evangeline, though the usually composed noblewoman looked distinctly disheveled. "Something's wrong," Clara called to Gale, who immediately abandoned his gardening and joined her at the window. Lady Evangeline dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, her expression grim with purpose and fear. Clara met her at the door, already reaching for the traveling cloak that hung permanently ready beside the entrance. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," Lady Evangeline said without preamble, "but we have a situation that requires immediate attention, something unprecedented, something that threatens the very balance of the supernatural world." "Tell us," Gale said, appearing beside Clara with their traveling bags already packed. 6 months of working together had taught them to read each other's intentions with perfect clarity. "Raven's Hollow Manor," Lady Evangeline said, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice. "The place where your story began, Clara. Something has awakened there, something that's been sleeping beneath the foundations since the house was built. The magical community is in chaos. Every sensitive within 100 miles is reporting nightmares, visions, spiritual disturbances of unprecedented intensity." Clara felt the mark on her wrist begin to burn with familiar heat. "What kind of something?" "We don't know exactly, but whatever it is, it's connected to you specifically. The disturbances began the day after your awakening, but they've remained dormant until now. Yesterday, something changed. The entity, for lack of a better word, began actively reaching out, and every vision, every nightmare, every supernatural disturbance carries the same message." Lady Evangeline's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's calling for Clara Romanelli by name." The journey to Yorkshire passed in tense silence, each mile bringing them closer to the place where Clara's transformation had begun. But as familiar landmarks appeared outside the car windows, Clara began to sense something that made her deeply uneasy. The spiritual disturbance Lady Evangeline had described wasn't just affecting the supernatural community, it was affecting the very fabric of reality itself. Trees along the roadside twisted toward their passing car as if seeking something they carried. Animals stood in unnatural poses in the fields, all facing the same direction, toward Raven's Hollow Manor. Even the sky seemed different, clouds forming patterns that looked almost like ancient symbols, all pointing toward their destination. "It knows we're coming," Clara said quietly, watching a murder of ravens follow their car with predatory interest. "Good," Gale replied, his jaw set with determination. "Let it know. We're not the same people who left here 6 months ago. If it wants to face us, it will find us considerably more formidable than it expects." Raven's Hollow Manor loomed before them as imposing as ever, but Clara could immediately see that something fundamental had changed. The house seemed larger somehow, as if additional stories had been added that existed only partially in normal reality. Windows that shouldn't exist gleamed with light that hurt to look at directly, and the shadows cast by the building moved independently of any light source. Most disturbing of all, Clara could see her younger self moving through the windows, not a vision or a memory, but what appeared to be an actual manifestation of the invisible housemaid she had once been, cleaning and polishing and dusting in endless, mechanical repetition. "It's trying to trap you in the past," Gale observed grimly. "Whatever this entity is, it feeds on regression, on preventing growth and change." Stevens met them at the front door, though the nervous little man looked as if he had aged years in the past 6 months. His eyes held the glassy quality of someone who had seen too much of the supernatural world without adequate preparation. "Miss Romanelli," he said, his voice shaking with relief and terror in equal measure. "Thank God you've come. It's been asking for you constantly, calling your name through the walls. The other staff have fled. I'm the only one left, and I'm not entirely certain I'm still sane." "What exactly have you seen, Stevens?" Clara asked gently, though her attention was divided between the man's obvious distress and the spiritual pressure she could feel building around them like an approaching storm. "Yourself, miss. Everywhere in the house, all the time, but not as you are now, as you were when you first came here, cleaning the same rooms over and over, following the same routines as if trapped in some sort of eternal loop." Stevens wrung his hands nervously. "And it speaks, miss. It tells me that you belong here, that you should never have left, that it's going to make everything the way it was supposed to be." Clara felt understanding dawn with cold certainty. "It's not just any entity. It's the spiritual imprint of the house itself, fed by decades of supernatural energy and given form by my presence here, hence trying to preserve the version of me that it knew, to prevent the changes that threaten its stability." "Houses can become conscious?" Lady Evangeline asked. "Old houses built on sites of power, inhabited by people with supernatural abilities. Yes, they can develop a primitive form of awareness," Gale confirmed. "Usually they're benevolent, protective. But if this one has been feeding on Clara's pain and invisibility for months, it's become addicted to keeping her powerless," Clara finished. "It wants its invisible housemaid back, and it's going to fight to prevent me from remaining who I've become." As if summoned by their conversation, the temperature in the entrance hall dropped dramatically. Frost began forming on the windows, despite the mild spring weather outside, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Then she appeared, the other Clara, the ghost of who she had once been, pale, frightened, dressed in the grey uniform that had been her armor against the world's notice. She moved through the hall with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions, carrying cleaning supplies that cast no shadow and left no trace of their passage. "You came back," the apparition said, though her lips didn't move, and the voice seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I knew you would. I've been waiting, keeping everything exactly as it should be. Your room is ready, your uniform is clean, your duties are waiting." "I'm not her anymore," Clara said firmly, though she couldn't deny the pang of recognition and sympathy she felt looking at her former self. "I've grown beyond what I was. I've found love, purpose, power, everything she was afraid to reach for." "Lies," the house spirit hissed, and every window in the manor rattled with the force of its displeasure. "You were safe here. You were hidden, protected from the world that would hurt you. I kept you safe, and this is how you repay me? By abandoning everything, by becoming something dangerous and unrecognizable." Clara felt the pull then, a spiritual tether trying to draw her back into the role she had once played, to reduce her to the frightened girl who had found safety in invisibility. For a moment she wavered, caught between the seductive promise of never having to face challenges or responsibilities again and the vibrant reality of the life she had claimed. Then Gale's hand found hers, warm and solid and radiating absolute faith in who she had become. The mark on her wrist flared with brilliant light, and Clara remembered everything she had gained, everything she was fighting to protect. "You weren't keeping me safe," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You were keeping me prisoner. You fed on my fear, my loneliness, my conviction that I didn't deserve better. But I do deserve better, and I've found it." The battle that erupted then was unlike anything Clara had faced before. This wasn't an external enemy she could fight with magic and determination. This was a twisted version of herself, powered by all her old fears and insecurities, given form and purpose by a house that had grown drunk on her pain. The apparition of her younger self multiplied, filling the manor with dozens of grey uniformed figures, all going through the motions of cleaning and polishing and hiding from notice. They moved with mechanical precision, trapping Clara and her companions in a maze of repetitive, meaningless motion. "You were content here," the voices whispered from every direction. "You were safe here. Why risk pain and loss and responsibility when you could return to the safety of invisibility?" For a terrifying moment, Clara almost believed them. The weight of the past 6 months, the battles, the responsibility, the constant awareness of just how much she could lose if something happened to Gale, pressed down on her like a physical force. How much easier it would be to return to the simple life of following orders, avoiding attention, asking for nothing more than basic survival. But then she looked at Gale, saw the love and pride and fierce protectiveness blazing in his green eyes, and remembered what it felt like to be truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. She thought of little Sophia Blackwood, alive and healthy because Clara had been brave enough to use her power. She thought of the grateful letters they received from people whose lives had been touched by their work. The difference they made simply by refusing to hide their light under the bushel of false humility. "No," she said, and her voice carried the accumulated strength of 43 lifetimes. "I choose growth over safety. I choose love over solitude. I choose to be who I was meant to be rather than who I was afraid to be." The power that flowed from her then wasn't just her own. It was shared with Gale, amplified by their bond, supported by every person whose life they had touched and improved. Silver and gold light erupted from their joined hands, washing through the manor like cleansing fire. The apparitions of her younger self didn't simply disappear, they transformed. Clara watched in wonder as each grey-uniformed figure became a different woman, strong, confident, radiant with purpose and power. They were all her, all the versions of herself she might have become if she had been brave enough to claim her heritage sooner. "Thank you," each figure whispered as the light touched them, "for finally setting us free." The house itself shuddered and groaned as the twisted consciousness that had taken root in its foundations was cleansed away. But instead of collapsing or becoming ordinary, Raven's Hollow Manor seemed to exhale with relief, its stones settling into configurations that spoke of peace rather than predatory hunger. "It's over," Clara said, swaying slightly from the effort of channeling so much power. "Not quite," Gale said softly, catching her before she could fall. "Look around, Clara, really look." Clara opened her enhanced perception fully and gasped at what she saw. The manor was transforming before her eyes, shifting from the Gothic monument to solitude it had been into something warmer, more welcoming. The oppressive weight of accumulated sorrow was lifting, replaced by an atmosphere of potential and hope. "What's happening? You've cleansed not just the conscious entity, but the spiritual imprint of centuries of loneliness and isolation," Lady Evangeline said, wonder evident in her voice. "The house is becoming what it always could have been, a sanctuary for those who need healing, a place where people can discover their true strength." Stevens appeared in the doorway, his face transformed by the first genuine smile Clara had ever seen from him. "Miss Romanelli, I don't know how to thank you. For the first time in decades, this house feels like a home rather than a beautiful prison." Clara looked around at the manor that had been the starting point of her transformation, feeling a deep sense of completion. The frightened girl who had cleaned these halls in careful invisibility was finally truly gone, not destroyed, but evolved into someone worthy of the love and power she had inherited. "What will happen to Raven's Hollow now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," Lady Evangeline replied. "As the one who broke its curse, you have a certain claim on the property. The council would support any decision you make regarding its future." Clara considered the possibilities, then looked at Gale with a smile that held the promise of new adventures. "I think it should become what it was always meant to be. A place where people can discover who they're truly meant to be. A school, perhaps, for those with supernatural abilities who need guidance and training." "With you and Gale as the founding instructors?" Lady Evangeline asked hopefully. "Part-time," Clara agreed. "We still have our consulting work, our life at the lake. But yes, I think we could help others avoid the loneliness and fear that kept me trapped for so long." As they prepared to leave Raven's Hollow for the last time as visitors rather than residents, Clara found herself in the room that had been hers during those months of invisibility. But instead of the Spartan servants' quarters she remembered, she found a comfortable sitting room with large windows that looked out over gardens beginning to bloom with new life. On the writing desk sat an envelope addressed in her own handwriting, though she had no memory of writing it. Inside was a letter from her past self, not an apparition or spiritual imprint, but something she had apparently written during her time as a housemaid and forgotten. "Dear future me," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if the dreams I've been having about a man with green eyes and a love that transcends death will ever come true. But if they do, if you're reading this as someone who has found the courage to claim the life I'm too frightened to reach for, then I want you to know how proud I am of who you've become. I see her sometimes in the mirror when I'm brave enough to really look, the woman I could be if I weren't so afraid of being noticed, of wanting more than survival, of believing I deserve love and happiness and purpose. She's beautiful and powerful and loved beyond measure. She's everything I dream of being, but don't dare attempt to become. If you're her, if you found the strength to transform from invisible to radiant, then please don't forget where you came from. Please remember that the frightened girl who cleaned these halls also had courage, even if she didn't recognize it. She survived when survival seemed impossible. She kept hoping when hope seemed foolish. She preserved the capacity for love, even when love seemed like an impossible luxury. Thank you for becoming who I always knew you could be. Thank you for proving that stories of transformation and true love aren't just fairy tales. Thank you for having the courage to live the life I could only dream about. With love and admiration, your former self. Clara read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. She could barely remember the girl who had written these words, but she felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her from that place of fear and invisibility to this moment of complete fulfillment. "Are you ready to go home?" Gale asked from the doorway, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," Clara said, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into her coat pocket. "I'm ready." The drive back to the Lake District passed in comfortable silence, both of them processing the significance of what had just occurred. Clara found herself thinking not just about the spiritual battle they had won, but about the symbolism of returning to Ravenshollow as someone completely transformed from the person who had left. The cottage welcomed them with warm light spilling from every window and the scent of Moira's cooking drifting from the kitchen. Their elderly guardian met them at the door with embraces and the kind of meal that spoke of celebration rather than mere sustenance. "I felt the disturbance resolve from here," Moira said as they settled around the kitchen table. The spiritual pressure that's been building for months suddenly lifted, as if a storm had finally broken and cleared the air. "It's done," Clara confirmed. "The house spirit has been cleansed. Ravenshollow is free to become what it was always meant to be, and I—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I finally understand that transformation isn't a destination, but a continuous journey. There will always be more growth, more challenges, more opportunities to become stronger and wiser and more loving. And more dangerous cases requiring your particular expertise," Moira added with a knowing smile. "Lady Evangeline left word that there's been increased supernatural activity in Scotland. Something about a haunted castle and a family curse that goes back 7 generations. Clara looked at Gale, seeing her own excitement and anticipation reflected in his green eyes. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow," he said, his hand finding hers across the table. "But tonight we celebrate coming home to each other once again." Later, as they lay tangled together in their bed, with moonlight streaming through windows that looked out over the peaceful lake, Clara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From invisible housemaid to powerful sorceress, from solitary survivor to beloved partner, from hiding her light to using it to illuminate the darkness in other people's lives. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't answered Stephen's summons that day?" she asked, tracing lazy patterns on Gale's chest. "No," he replied without hesitation, "because it wouldn't have mattered. We were always going to find each other. Clara, in this lifetime or the next, in this reality or another, our souls would have kept searching until they came home to each other. Even if I had remained too frightened to claim my power, even then, love like ours doesn't depend on magic or supernatural abilities. It depends on recognition, on the way two souls call to each other across time and space, and every barrier that tries to keep them apart." He tilted her chin up so she was looking directly into his eyes. "I would have loved you as a housemaid, just as completely as I love you as the most powerful woman in Britain. Power is wonderful, but it's not what makes you essential to my existence." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude for a love so complete, so unconditional, so eternal, that it had literally conquered death to find expression. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "In this life and every life to come, until the stars burn out and time itself ends." "I love you too," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of forever. As they made love with the gentle passion of couple who had all of eternity to explore each other, Clara found herself thinking about the future, stretching endlessly before them. There would be more cases to solve, more people to help, more challenges to face together. There would be the school at Ravenshollow to establish, students to train, a new generation of supernatural practitioners to guide. But most importantly, there would be this, the quiet moments of perfect